It was August 12th, and the shift at the toll booth began like any other. The night was warm, with crickets filling the air with their rhythmic song. But as soon as the clock hit midnight, the eerie quietness settled in. The first rule echoed in my mind: never leave the booth after midnight. The thought of stepping outside now sent a chill down my spine. I stared at the old camera monitors in front of me, their black and white footage flickering slightly. Shadows danced in the trees lining the road, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, at least not yet. By 1 a.m., the silence had become unbearable. The wind outside rustled through the leaves, but inside the booth, it was stiflingly still. My eyes darted to the second rule: never respond to knocks on the window. As if on cue, a soft, almost hesitant knock came from behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, every muscle tensing as the knocking grew louder, more insistent. I wanted to look back, to see what, or who, was there. But the rules kept me glued to my seat. My pulse quickened as I tried to ignore the sound, focusing instead on the camera feeds. They began to flicker more frequently now, static buzzing across the screen. And then, at exactly 3 a.m., I saw it. A figure, barely more than a silhouette, stood in the middle of the road on the screen. It was too far away to make out any details, but it just stood there, motionless. The third rule whispered in my mind: always check the camera feeds at 3 a.m. But the figure shouldn't have been there. Not at this hour. Fear settled in the pit of my stomach as the knocking suddenly stopped. I strained to listen, but all I could hear was my own breathing, quick and shallow. The figure on the screen remained perfectly still, as though it was watching me just as closely as I was watching it. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the monitor, but before I could adjust it, the figure vanished in a blink. The screen went back to static, leaving me alone with the darkness and the dread. The next night, August 13th, I returned to the toll booth with a growing sense of dread. The summer night felt heavier than before, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of what had happened the night before. I couldn't shake the image of that figure from my mind. Who or what had been standing in the middle of the road at 3 a.m.? As I settled into my chair, I noticed that the rules taped to the wall seemed to glare at me, their presence a constant reminder of the strange events I had to endure. By 11 p.m., the knocking started again. Only this time, it was quicker, sharper. It was as if whatever was outside had grown impatient. My fingers gripped the edges of the desk, knuckles white, as I tried to block out the sound. The rule was clear: never respond. But with each knock, the temptation grew stronger. What if it was just a prank, or someone messing with me? But then, as the clock struck midnight, the knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. I glanced at the camera feeds, scanning the roads and the nearby forest. Everything looked normal, until it didn't. Out of the corner of the screen, I saw the shadow again, the same figure from the night before. It stood farther back this time, barely visible between the trees, but unmistakably there. My pulse quickened as I watched it for what felt like hours, though in reality, it was only minutes. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just lingered on the edge of the darkness, as though waiting. The minutes crawled by, and I found myself holding my breath as the clock neared 3 a.m. When the time came, I stared at the monitors, bracing myself for what I might see. But tonight, the figure didn't appear in the middle of the road. Instead, it remained just within the tree line, shrouded in shadow, like it was trying to stay hidden. My stomach twisted with a mix of fear and confusion. What was it waiting for? Why hadn't it left like before? A cold sweat formed on my brow as I realized that the figure wasn't disappearing. It was just standing there, watching. My hands shook as I tried to focus on something, anything else, but my eyes kept drifting back to the camera. The longer I stared at the shadowy figure, the more convinced I became that it was aware of me too. And then, just as suddenly as before, it was gone. No movement, no warning, just vanished into the night, leaving me with a gnawing sense of unease. The night of August 14th felt different from the moment I arrived. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel an uneasy weight pressing down on me, like something terrible was about to happen. I sat down at the desk, my eyes drifting toward the rules on the wall. They seemed more oppressive now, more like a warning than guidance. The shadow, the knocks, the silence, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle I was too scared to solve. By midnight, the forest outside was deathly quiet. The crickets, which had once been a constant companion, had gone silent. I strained my ears for any sign of life, but all I heard was my own heartbeat, thudding heavily in my chest. I tried to focus on the camera feeds, scanning them over and over again, but the figure was nowhere to be seen. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax. Maybe whatever had been haunting me was finally gone. But then, the whispers began. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my breathing. I thought I was imagining them, just the result of my frayed nerves. But as the minutes passed, they grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Something was trying to communicate with me. My skin prickled with fear, and I found myself gripping the edges of the desk, trying to hold on to some sense of reality. I glanced at the clock. 2:45 a.m., 15 minutes until 3 a.m., the time the figure usually appeared. My stomach churned as the whispers grew louder, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block them out, but the voices were relentless, pushing me to the edge of my sanity. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the camera feed flickered. When I opened my eyes, the figure was back. This time, it was closer than ever before, standing just outside the booth. Its shadowy form loomed in the corner of the screen, its presence sending a wave of dread crashing over me. My throat tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was there, right outside. I wanted to run, to escape, but the rules held me in place. Never leave the booth after midnight. My hands shook as I watched the screen, praying that it would vanish like before. But it didn't. It stayed. The figure stood still, a shadow against the night, pressing in on me from just outside the toll booth. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to break the rules, but fear rooted me to my chair. My eyes stayed glued to the monitor, watching the dark outline of whatever it was, unmoving, but so close now. The air in the booth felt suffocating, as if it was draining all the oxygen out of the room. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, louder than anything else. For minutes, I didn't move. The booth was a cage now, the rules a prison keeping me trapped inside. My gaze flicked to the door. The figure was just out of sight from the window, but I knew it was there, waiting, watching. The whispers had stopped, leaving an eerie, unnatural silence. I clenched my fists, trying to stay calm, but the weight of the situation pressed down on me. What would happen if I broke the rules? Would anything be worse than the terror of waiting? With my nerves frayed and the air growing heavier, I made the decision. I stood up slowly, inching toward the door, my legs trembling beneath me. The rules had been nothing but a chain holding me back, and I was ready to break free. My hand hovered over the door handle, my breath shaky. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. My hand closed around the handle, cold and slick with sweat, and I braced myself for what might happen next. I pulled the door open, stepping outside. The night greeted me with an oppressive stillness. The air felt thick, almost tangible, but the figure, it was gone. Nothing moved in the darkness around me. The shadows remained, but there was no sign of the presence that had haunted me for days. The toll booth, now behind me, suddenly seemed insignificant, a relic of fear that no longer had power over me. Relief washed over me like a wave. The fear, the dread, all of it disappeared the moment I stepped outside. The rules had been nothing but a trap, a way to keep me confined to the booth, feeding my own paranoia. I walked away from the toll booth that night and never returned. Whatever had been out there, whatever had been watching me, was gone. And for the first time in days, I felt free. The campground was quiet as I began my night shift. The usual campers tucked away in their tents and RVs. But there was something unsettling about this place at night. Once the sun dipped below the horizon, a thick fog would roll in, covering the ground like a shroud. Tonight was no different. The fog crept in slowly, swallowing the trees and the paths, making everything look distorted. The air became damp, and the temperature dropped sharply, making me shiver as I walked the perimeter. I had heard stories from other employees, whispers of strange figures seen moving in the fog, flickers of light that couldn't be explained. I had never believed them, chalking it up to overactive imaginations and the isolation of the night. But as I stood there, alone in the fog, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional distant owl, had disappeared, leaving only an eerie silence. As I made my way down the gravel path, my flashlight flickering in the mist, I began to see shapes. At first, I thought they were just trees, branches twisted into odd angles by the fog's distortion. But then they started to move, slowly, deliberately. I froze, squinting into the thick mist, trying to make out what was in front of me. It looked like a person, standing still in the fog. My heart raced, and I took a cautious step forward, but the figure didn't move. A cold wave of fear swept over me as I realized the shape wasn't going away. It wasn't fading back into the trees or disappearing like a trick of the light. It just stood there, watching, waiting. I couldn't make out any details. No face, no clothes, just a dark outline. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly backed away. My eyes locked on the figure. And then, just like that, it vanished, swallowed by the fog, as if it had never been there at all. The next night, I returned to the campground, my mind still buzzing with the image of that shadowy figure dissolving into the fog. The air was cool and damp, the fog rolling in thicker and earlier than usual. As I walked my usual patrol, the mist seemed to cling to my skin, making the night feel heavier, almost suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My flashlight flickered weakly through the dense fog, barely illuminating the trees in front of me. The shadows in the fog were more distinct tonight. They moved slowly, almost like they were pacing just outside the reach of my light. I tried to convince myself that it was just the fog playing tricks on my mind, but the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They came from all directions, echoing through the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint where they originated. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to make out what the voices were saying, but they were just out of reach, unintelligible but undeniably there. The footsteps followed me wherever I went. They crunched softly on the gravel path, mirroring my own, yet I couldn't see anyone around me. Every time I stopped, the footsteps would stop too, only to resume when I began walking again. My breath quickened, and the air around me seemed to thicken, making it hard to draw a full breath. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing there. Just the fog and the whispers swirling together in the dark. I continued walking, trying to push the fear down, but it clawed at me, making my skin crawl. The figures in the fog seemed to close in on me, moving faster now. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs as panic started to take hold. I broke into a jog, desperate to reach the safety of the small cabin at the edge of the campground. But as I ran, the whispers grew louder, almost as if they were calling me back, urging me to turn around. I didn't dare look back. By the time I reached the cabin, my hands were shaking. The small wooden structure provided little comfort, but at least it gave me a brief moment of relief from the oppressive fog outside. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. The whispers outside had faded, replaced by the unnerving sound of silence. I glanced out of the cabin window, expecting to see nothing but the mist-covered trees. But something was different. There, just beyond the window, was a shape. A dark figure standing still, almost blending into the fog. It wasn't moving, but I could feel its presence pressing against the glass, watching me. My throat tightened as I slowly backed away from the window, the figure never breaking its silent gaze. My pulse quickened, and I felt an icy chill creep down my spine. Whatever was outside was no longer content with just lingering in the shadows. It was getting closer. I grabbed the flashlight again, desperate to shine it on the figure, to expose whatever was lurking outside. My hands trembled as I flicked it on and directed the beam toward the window. The figure seemed to shift in the light, its outline blurring and distorting, but it didn't disappear. Instead, it seemed to become more solid, more real. My breath hitched in my throat as I realized that whatever was out there was no trick of the fog. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. The whispers returned, this time louder, almost angry. They filled the cabin, making it impossible to think. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block them out, but the voices only grew more insistent, more demanding. My mind raced as I struggled to understand what they wanted from me. It felt like they were trying to pull me outside, into the fog, to where the figure was waiting. Fear gripped me, and I knew that if I stepped outside, I might never come back. The figure outside the window remained still, but the tension in the air was unbearable. I could feel it waiting, watching, as if it was daring me to come closer. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a trap. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the window, the whispers swirling around me, filling the air with their relentless presence. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay here much longer. The air in the cabin felt thick, almost as if the fog had seeped inside and was closing in on me. I couldn't escape the feeling that the walls were tightening around me, and the whispers continued their assault, growing louder and more urgent. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel the meaning behind them. Something wanted me to leave the cabin, to step outside and face whatever was waiting in the fog. I paced the small room, my thoughts racing. The figure outside remained motionless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was drawing closer, even without moving. The silence in the cabin was oppressive, and every instinct I had was telling me to run. But where could I go? The fog outside was too thick, and the forest seemed like a maze that would swallow me whole. Still, I knew I couldn't stay here. The cabin wasn't safe anymore. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. My eyes flicked toward the door, and I knew what I had to do. The whispers were pulling me toward it, and I felt like I had no choice but to follow. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling with fear. Whatever was waiting for me outside, I had to confront it. I couldn't keep hiding in the cabin, hoping it would go away. It was either step out and face the unknown, or remain trapped in my own fear. With a surge of determination, I yanked the door open and stepped into the fog. The cold air wrapped around me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The figure was gone. The space outside the cabin was empty, silent except for the sound of my breathing. I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The whispers had stopped, and the air was still. But I knew it wasn't over. Something had changed. I walked further into the fog, searching for any sign of the figure, but there was nothing, only the trees looming in the mist. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I noticed something carved into one of the trees, a strange symbol, glowing faintly in the dim light. I reached out to touch it, feeling an odd warmth beneath my fingertips. As I traced the symbol with my hand, I heard a voice, clear this time, whispering from just behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, only the fog, thick and unyielding. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped back from the tree, the weight of what I had experienced pressing down on me. The whispers were gone, but I could still feel their presence lingering in the air. I knew then that I wasn't alone in this place. Whatever had been haunting the campground was still there, watching, waiting. And though I had escaped for now, I wasn't sure if I had truly left it behind. I had decided to spend a few nights alone at my usual camping spot, a quiet clearing deep within the woods. The first evening was peaceful, the kind of silence I had craved after weeks of stress. But as the sun set, that silence grew unnerving. The usual forest sounds, crickets, distant owls, faded away, replaced by an almost tangible stillness. I sat by the fire, the warmth doing little to ease the growing sense of unease creeping over me. The shadows in the trees seemed to stretch longer than usual, like they were watching me. As the night deepened, I began to feel it, a presence. At first, it was just a subtle sensation, like a chill crawling up my spine. I glanced around, the fire casting flickering light across the clearing, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Yet the feeling wouldn't leave me. It was as though the woods themselves were alive, holding their breath, waiting for something. My heart began to race, but I pushed the fear down, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I tried to distract myself, adding more wood to the fire, but the sense of being watched only intensified. Every rustle of leaves felt deliberate, every snap of a twig more like a footstep. The wind whispered through the trees, but instead of its usual soothing sound, it seemed to carry something darker, something I couldn't quite place. I gripped my flashlight tighter, scanning the edge of the clearing, but the beam of light revealed only trees and shadows. That's when I heard it. Just beyond the reach of the firelight, a branch cracked. My pulse quickened as I aimed the flashlight toward the noise, half expecting to see an animal. But the light only revealed more trees, thick with shadow. The presence, however, felt closer now, almost like it was standing right behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for something, anything to show itself. But the forest remained eerily still. The next morning brought little comfort. The sun had risen, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that it had all been in my head. As I hiked through the woods, the normal sounds of the forest had returned. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, but everything still felt wrong, as if the forest itself was aware of me in a way it hadn't been before. I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me like a second skin. When night fell again, the same oppressive silence descended over the woods. I lit a fire and sat close to it, the flames crackling loudly in the quiet. The darkness pressed in around me, thick and impenetrable beyond the circle of light the fire provided. Every now and then, I'd hear movement just out of sight, branches snapping, leaves crunching. But whenever I pointed my flashlight in that direction, nothing was there. The presence I'd felt the night before was back, stronger this time, and closer. I tried to keep calm, but the silence felt unnatural, heavy with expectation. My mind raced, replaying the strange sounds and sensations from the previous night. The fire began to die down, and as the light dimmed, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. My breath quickened, and I gripped the flashlight tighter, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The woods felt like they were closing in on me, the shadows darker, deeper, and more alive than before. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it again. A branch snapping, but this time much closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned toward the sound. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand, revealing nothing but dense trees and darkness. But I knew something was out there, watching me from just beyond the firelight. The air around me felt charged, heavy with something I couldn't see but could definitely feel. And in that moment, I realized that whatever it was waiting for me to make the next move. I couldn't sleep. The presence in the woods was all I could think about, looming over me even in the relative safety of the firelight. The air was thick with tension, and every rustle of leaves felt like a warning. I kept the fire burning brighter this time, determined not to let the darkness creep in any further. Yet no matter how hard I tried, I could feel the eyes of the forest on me, watching, waiting. My hands shook slightly as I poked at the fire, trying to stay focused and calm, but my nerves were frayed. Hours passed, but the feeling only intensified. I began to hear subtle movements again, this time circling my camp. My pulse raced, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The sound was deliberate now, as if whatever was out there wanted me to know it was getting closer. I stood up slowly, flashlight in hand, and scanned the surrounding trees, but the beam only revealed more shadows. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. As I stared into the woods, something caught my eye. A fleeting movement between the trees. It was quick, almost too quick to notice, but it was enough to send a surge of adrenaline through my body. I aimed the flashlight toward the spot, but nothing moved. The shadows seemed to close in tighter around the beam of light, almost like they were swallowing it whole. My breathing grew shallow, and my heart pounded so loudly in my ears that it drowned out the sound of the crackling fire. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the movement stopped. The woods fell silent once again, but the air was electric with anticipation. I lowered the flashlight slowly, my hands shaking. The fire was dying down, and the darkness was creeping closer, wrapping itself around the camp like a heavy blanket. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. Whatever was out there was growing bolder, and I had the sinking feeling that it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. But I had no idea what that was, or how to stop it. I had to make a decision. The fire was almost out, and the oppressive darkness was closing in fast. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but every step I took away from the fire felt like walking straight into a trap. The forest was still, too still, as if it was waiting for me to make the wrong move. I grabbed my backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and clutched the flashlight tightly. I told myself that if I stayed any longer, I'd be giving whatever was out there exactly what it wanted. As I stepped away from the fire, the forest came alive with movement. Shadows darted between the trees, faster than I could follow, but always just on the edge of my vision. My heart raced as I pushed forward, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes watching my every move. My footsteps felt loud in the quiet, each crunch of the forest floor echoing in the still air. I kept the flashlight trained ahead, but it barely cut through the thick, swirling darkness. The presence was stronger now, closer. I quickened my pace, the sensation of being hunted growing unbearable. Every sound seemed amplified, the snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves, like something was following right behind me. The shadows flitted around me, closing in from all sides. Panic gripped me, but I forced myself to keep moving. I didn't dare look back. My breath came in ragged gasps as I navigated through the trees, my legs burning with effort. The presence seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, as though it was closing in for the final strike. Suddenly, I stumbled into a clearing, the trees parting like a gateway into open space. The feeling of being watched vanished instantly, as if the forest had released me from its grasp. I collapsed to the ground, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The sky above was beginning to lighten with the first signs of dawn. Whatever had been in the woods was gone, for now. But deep down, I knew the forest still held its secrets, and I had barely escaped with mine. Something in me had changed, and I knew I would never be the same after this night.